caught in a trap will gnaw off its own leg to escape. What will you do?
One of the basic claims you'll hear me make over and over again is that I don't know the complete list of things that exist, but I do know that no particular thing needs to be on that list. And if a thing is on that list today, it doesn't need to be there tomorrow. Any particular being or any particular set of beings can cease to exist. People typically think of God as necessary, and that's what I've just denied the existence of. This still leaves open the possibility of a contingent triomni being, however, and I think the logical problem of evil is a good reason to reject any such notion of a triomni being. The version of the problem I like is worded in a pretty specific way, and I think it's actually pretty easy for theists to escape if they're willing to bite a few bullets. So, the point of this video is to establish two things. First, what bullets must be bitten in the negation of any of these propositions. And second, that attempts to negate number three are actually negations of four. So, number one, God can will any logically possible world. Two, God knows in advance all events which will take place in the world he wills. Proposition three, God would not will a world in which events that, all things considered, ought not take place, do take place. Number four, events which, all things considered, ought not take place, do take place. In short, God can avoid X, knows how to avoid X, and wants to avoid X, and yet does not avoid X. Proposition one is just a basic description of omnipotence, a capacity to act that is bounded only by non contradiction. Proposition two is just omniscience. God knows everything that will happen from before the moment of creation. He set the world up in such and such a way and knows exactly how it will play out. Proposition three is particularly ugly, right? Instead of this endless phrase, events which all things considered ought not take place, why not just say evil exists? Well, let's break it down. Events is a broad word for something which happens, right? Rain falling and a person shooting a gun are both events. We assign no moral responsibility to rain falling, although we do potentially do so to a person shooting a gun. Which sort of event is my argument talking about? It actually does not matter. It's just talking about events in the broadest sense of the term. The phrase all things considered just means once all relevant facts are considered, here's the answer. Do humans know all the relevant facts? Maybe not. Maybe humans don't have access to the all things considered answer. Maybe that's locked up in the mind of God. That's fine, doesn't matter. Whatever the all things considered answer is, that's what the argument is about. Ought or ought not take place is a straightforwardly normative claim. It doesn't matter why the event ought or ought not take place. If God's command or nature is the only relevant fact in why something ought or ought not take place, then that's perfectly fine. Some people might say their version of morality is not normative, and that's fine. We'll deal with them later. Proposition 4 uses the same language to say that regardless of which facts are locked up inaccessibly in the mind of God, events which ought not take place have taken place. You can avoid all this by dropping or negating any one of the propositions. Negating any proposition 1 through 4 resolves the problem. So negate 1. God cannot logically will any possible world. Negating 2, God does not know in advance all the events which will take place in the world he wills. Negating 3, God would will a world in which events which, all things considered, ought not take place, do take place. Negating 4, no events which, all things considered, ought not take place, take place. So how could we negate 1? One could add additional limitations on omnipotence. In this case, God would be incapable, for whatever reason, of making a logically consistent world in which events, which, all things considered, ought not take place, do not take place. The bullet to be bitten here is that these additional limitations, whatever they are not strictly derived from omnipotence, but rather as a response to the problem of evil. Adding additional limitations on omnipotence in order to resolve the problem of evil indicates that the standard notion of omnipotence is somehow inadequate. So, negating 2. God could be ignorant of some of the outcomes of his actions. While we would continue to quibble over his responsibility for these events, given his omnipotence, the same sort of strict inconsistency would no longer obtain. Plenty of theists take this option and are generally referred to as open theists. I do think open theism avoids the problem I'm pointing at, and I'm not really aware of any serious problems here. Okay, now negating 3. I like this one. One obvious route is to say God is not a moral agent. Spinoza's God produces both genocides and smiling children, and this is perfectly fine because Spinoza's God is not an agent who chooses which world to will, or actualize, or produce. Non-Spinozists generally want to avoid this, of course, and have other routes. I think, however, all attempted negations of 3 that I can think of are actually negations of 4. One attempt to negate 3 is to make a distinction between the capital G good and all things considered oughtness. So we could say 1, God is perfectly good. 2, God would will a world in which events that, all things considered, ought not take place do take place. Conclusion, willing that which, all things considered, ought not to take place is compatible with perfect goodness. Can I straightforwardly say there's some kind of logical problem here? No, I can't, because of the many varieties of what goodness means. For example, if goodness and badness are somehow straightforwardly synonymous with or mapped onto being and non-being, then it may be that all things considered oughtness is a senseless category. Of course, then the proposition, this genocide, all things considered, ought not have taken place, is either false or senseless. That's why I think this negation of 3 is a negation of 4. Of course, there's an alternative response. God has 3 wills: the decretive will, prescriptive will, and a permissive will. The decretive will says which events will take place. The prescriptive will says which events ought to take place. And the permissive will says which events can take place, especially with regards to finite agents. This seems to give the Christian a perfectly comfortable escape route, right? No arm gnawing required. They can say, God would permissively will a world in which events, all things considered, ought not take place, do take place. But this is why the all things considered phrase is so important. 3 categories of will means 3 things that must be considered with regards to which events ought take place. Let's assume these 3 wills do not compete inside God, that God's motivations are not confused. What will happen includes what God will. And so what God will is dictated by God's decretive will. The contents of God's prescriptive and permissive will are dictated by God's decretive will. In this case, the category of all things considered oughtness may be senseless or a partial human view of the world. And so the claim that events which, all things considered, ought not have taken place have taken place is either senseless or false, depending on how you emphasize things. And of course, this will entail the claim that this genocide ought not have taken place, all things considered, is also false or senseless. And that is a denial of 4, not 3. And now we come to the negation of 4. No events have taken place which, all things considered, ought not have taken place. This is simple for a Spinozist to assert. His position leaves no room for an all things considered ought notness. Depending on how you read Spinoza, oughtness is only a function of the finite human perspective, or oughtness is entirely under the perspective of eternity. There are no events which ought not take place in the relevant sense. Other kinds of theists might also be willing to negate Proposition 4. For example, they may be entirely willing to accept that God's decretive will lends an all things considered oughtness to every event. Every sin, every genocide, in the end, ought to have taken place for the sake of, for example, God's good pleasure. Which in God's good pleasure would be the ultimate or only consideration when judging oughtness. Hence, any perspective that says these events ought not have taken place is partial and limited and must give way to the ultimate consideration of God's good pleasure. Accepting this is a successful negation of 4, and the inconsistent set of propositions is reduced to a consistent set of 3. So, to conclude and sum up, any one of the propositions can be negated by a theist, depending on which bullets they're willing to bite. Because it can be escaped with a bit of conceptual engineering on the part of a theist, this is less about refuting any and all forms of Christianity, much less the concept of God, and more about showing some difficulties, perhaps with perfect being theology or the worship worthiness of God. These will be issues for another time.